Okay, welcome back. This is part two of our lecture on the Renaissance. I want to go back a couple of slides because I did realize that I had glossed over one important thing I wanted to cover, which was on this slide I have a lot of different images, but probably one of the most important images here, although I do love the Della Francescas, probably one of the most important images here is a Masaccio. This Masaccio painting and Masaccio's career in particular um, is really important in terms of that transition from the way Giotto painted to the Renaissance. That now the search for a kind of a space to put figures on becomes much deeper, and now using perspective systems to do that becomes an important part of the way the Renaissance artists look at the world. Okay, so but as I said, this lecture is not going to be about the early Renaissance. It's going to be about three main artists plus one other. So we're talking about the big three, the three of the four turtles. So we're talking about Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and I'd love to talk a lot about Leonardo, but for right now, I just want to talk about the fact that he was a gorgeous painter, and that if for just his sketchbooks alone, he would be an incredibly significant and important artist. I like this comparison between these two paintings because it gives you an idea of what a brilliant draftsman Leonardo was, how beautifully he could draw, but also what a beautiful painter. And when you look at these two paintings, you can kind of get a sense of what this painting, the original, must have looked like in its high point. Like the second painting, this one was painted later, and in some ways, the saturation of color gives you a sense of what this might have looked like at an earlier stage. But I do think that in other ways, this is the much superior painting. The transparency in it, the softness of edge, just the way it's drawn, and also the colors not, especially the skin tone colors not getting super cool all together makes it a really gorgeous painting. Um, and like what I said earlier about the importance of oil painting in the Northern Renaissance, and then that concept getting imported to Italy, and that combined with the other interests that were already in the Italian Renaissance, and from that we get a whole new way of thinking about making painting that have lots of space. And one of the things that develops out of that is these two words, chiaroscuro, which basically just means light and dark, and it means figuring out ways to make a painting where the light reveals the form, and that forms and places merge into the darkness, so that we might, like in this shadow area here, where the shadow on the cloth and the shadow on the rocks almost completely merges together. But then as the light catches on form, it reveals the form and makes the form feel real and three-dimensional. So that's chiaroscuro. And then in with Da Vinci's work in particular, we have a very specific kind of technique that he used to achieve that effect, that chiaroscuro. And he developed a technique that a lot of artists later called sfumato, which basically means like smoke-like. And the idea is to paint these different layers of value as well as of color in these thin kind of veil-like layers of paint. This is something that you can do in oil painting that you couldn't do in lots of other medium. And so that he could build up the values slowly, getting richer and richer, darker and darker in places that need to get darker, but also more saturated colors as he needed it. Okay, so um, the second of the three that we're going to be talking about is Raphael, and Raphael's um, paintings are really, truly gorgeous. And remember, we looked at the School of Athens earlier. It's a great example of fresco painting. And Raphael, once again, if for no other reason, if just for his figure drawing, Raphael would be an important artist. I love this figure drawing right here, one of my favorites of all time. And number three is Michelangelo. And Michelangelo is well known as a painter, although in his lifetime he was not all that well known as a painter. He was well known as a sculptor and as an architect. And his painting was very much considered kind of a subset of his overall body of work. But the Sistine Chapel is truly a gorgeous work of art, and it's a great work of figure drawing, a great work of painting, a great example of fresco painting, but it is most importantly a great example of brilliant design. That he looked at this problem of how do I paint this long ceiling, and a really tricky, complicated situation, and the solution he came up with, knowing that it was going to be fresco, was to divide up the painting into sections, and it cleverly makes a really nice composition. Like I said, Michelangelo was most well known as a sculptor, and he has made some fantastic sculptures. Don't have the time to study all of them. Obviously, we've looked at Michelangelo's David a couple of times. And he was also, let me just quickly say, he was also very famous as a architect, but I don't quite have the time to talk about some of his most famous pieces. At the same time as the High Renaissance is going on in Rome and Florence, we also have other developments in other parts of Italy, and one of the most important parts of Italy is Venice. And in the Venetians, we have a different kind of painting school, probably most closely similar to what Leonardo was doing, but a different kind of painting school that was thinking about what the oil painters of the Northern Renaissance were doing, and thinking about perspective space that we saw in the early Renaissance, but also thinking about landscape and thinking about atmosphere. And so we have Bellini here. We've looked at this painting many times so far in the in this course. And then Giorgione is a student of Bellini, and we can see how Giorgione is thinking about a lot of the same things, but he is thinking about the landscape much more as a product of atmosphere, much more thinking about how the colors change as they go deeper into space, and also about softness of edge, and about the way the color can describe a particular time of day, particular moment. And then Titian was also a student of Bellini, as well as Giorgione. And Titian is probably the greatest painter of the Renaissance. So really should be considered part of that, the great three that we talk about. And one of the reasons why Titian is so important is that if you look at some of these paintings, whether it's like these kind of pastoral paintings uh, based on mythological themes, or a more traditional, realistic altarpiece painting like this one, that these paintings of Titian were the paintings that were most influential on the later Baroque artists, as well as to a degree on the Mannerists, and that so we look today at the Renaissance and we see the artists that interest us the most. But if we think about it through the eyes of what parts of the Renaissance had the most influence on the rest of Europe and on the later art periods, it has to be Titian and his influence on the Baroque. All right, thank you very much. Next, I'll be recording some lectures on the Baroque.